about today and about the larger issue, reflecting both small-scale local issues as well as the national agenda, which is the main subject here. One is we've heard a lot of conversations about money, and it is true that a lot of these projects we're talking about will in fact cost a heck of a lot of money, but there are some things that we can do at the local level that don't cost anything at all, other than political cost of trying to get local town meetings and so on to make some changes. And this is namely in things like zoning and environmental regulations about how close to waterways you can build your houses and so on and so forth. And these shouldn't be lost in the national conversation, even though the action item is at the local level. If there were state incentives and federal incentives for funding or so on, then I think a lot of towns would be more enabled and more prone to enact some of these local changes in zoning and so on. And that's a very important point, because all politics is local, but everybody does live in a town or a city somewhere. And yes, we're all United States citizens and so on, but we all pay our local taxes first and foremost as well. So I don't think that should be lost. That would also benefit from national and state coordination and ideas and suggestions for us all. But I don't think that point has been emphasized enough, and I think should be considered. Secondly, with the pendulum swinging to the other side of the question, is the point that, yeah, this is a huge issue. But I don't think we should be intimidated by the scale of the issue. I think we should embrace it. In fact, if you look at legislation that Mr. Cantwell was essential to getting enacted here in Massachusetts, involving a bond bill to help build some or maintain seawalls. It also brought together people from the western part of the state who are interested in removal of dams to enhance the environmental quality and fish runs and so on and so forth. So if we look at this as just a coastal problem, then we're going to really limit our constituency. And I think everybody in this room understands that the larger issue here is climate change. And just like in Massachusetts, we have coastal climate change issues, and we have issues in the western part of the state. And the gentleman earlier referred to the fact that Vermont is not a coastal community, but it got hammered during Irene. I think at the national level, we need to bring in people from the Mississippi River Valley, and not just New Orleans, but people in Iowa, people in Indiana, people in all those other areas as well, because climate change affects them just as much as it does us. In admittedly a very different way, but it's still part and parcel of the whole meal, as it were. So we need to continue to build our constituencies in that way. Also, two other quick points. I do think looking at insurance is very important, but also inheritance laws also need to be looked at. And again, this is potentially something that could be low-hanging fruit and doesn't cost much money. But the incentive these days, and I am speaking from the coastal perspective, but the incentive these days is strongly towards handing off our coastal property down to our children. And while that might be good for that family, it certainly doesn't solve the problem for the town. You just have a different owner owning the same house that's going to get slammed in the next northeaster or the next hurricane. And if we can change the conversation about the incentives from the insurance side, from the inheritance side, from the regulatory side, and it's going to take a patchwork of issues so that we're not sitting here in 30 years having this exact same conversation with a bunch of different people who aren't even born yet. And then lastly, yes, we've talked about infrastructure, but it was encouraging, of course, to see the example from the Netherlands, where they've been practicing what we've been calling here only recently managed retreat. No one likes to hear it, but the fact of the matter is we're not going to be able to armor everywhere. We're not going to be able to drain everywhere. There are going to need to be very real hard choices about what areas we're going to need to protect and what areas we are, in fact, going to have to walk away from. And this does not mean, and as a local politician, I will reassure you, I do get my head cut off every so often when I bring this subject up, so I want to be very clear. We need to preserve equity as we build in managed retreat. We're not talking about next Thursday at 3:15, everybody's going to get out, but we're talking about generational changes. There's a little beach in Scituate called Peggotty Beach, which used to have about 55, 60 homes on it, And then the blizzard of 78, which is our storm of record around here, blizzard of 78 came by and took out about 15 to 20 of those homes. Several Northeasters since then have whacked out about 5 or 8 more. And now there's about 14 or so homes on Peggotty Beach. So in 1977, there were about 50 homes, and right now in 2010, 2013, there are about 15. So that's a generational change. That's managed retreat. People were able to maintain their equity through one form or another, but the landscape, figuratively and physically, has changed dramatically. And that's something that we also need to look at, I think, over the long term as well. We're not going to be able to protect everything. We have to have a whole menu of approaches to solve this problem. Thank you very much to Jim and to Bill for having me here, and for all the presenters and everybody else. There have been very fascinating conversations during coffees and lunches as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Richard Delaney. I'm the president of the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown. It's good to be back with all of our colleagues. And I'm pleased that you mentioned Scituate. That's the home of the famous seawall that has been rebuilt 19 times with FEMA money. But however, the nice side of the coin is that same FEMA, there's a small provision in FEMA that allowed 15 of those houses to be given 105% of their pre-damaged value to get off Peggotty Beach. So it's a great example. But I want to talk to you about 3 examples of why we on Cape Cod are very, very excited that Bill and Kristen and Dwayne Morris and others are promoting this idea of this focus on coastal infrastructure, as we have our needs as well. First one is wastewater infrastructure. We on the Cape are dealing with basically a Boston Harbor deja vu situation. We've discovered that our embayments in our marshes and harbors are being overloaded with nutrients, and eutrophication is getting ahead of it. And it is not only an environmental issue, but a big economic issue. The Chamber of Commerce is actually leading the charge to deal with wastewater. And the Cape Cod Commission is doing a very nice job in trying to plan around a watershed basis on a regional effect. But the numbers probably will mean somewhere between $3.5 billion and $6.5 billion of infrastructure. Big range so far, but a lot of us are hopeful that 2 factors will drive it toward the $3.5 billion. The more we can incorporate biomimicry or using natural bioengineering as a way to reduce it and not have to build expensive engineered infrastructure, we can go to that lower end. And our friends at UMass Boston, Anna Marie Frankic and others have been helping us think that through. We also are working with the agencies, EPA, DEP, and local authorities to open up the thinking and the regulations about innovative and alternative technologies and techniques, because the more of those we can incorporate, we think we can also reduce that cost. So we're at a very important part of our planning process, but either way, it's going to cost a lot, and we really are going to need more than just the ratepayers on Cape Cod, who only number 250,000. That quadruples in the summer and really puts the pressure on us. But it's unlike the 2.5 million people who are paying for the Boston Harbor $4 billion. So you can see when you put the numbers side by side, we've got a huge challenge here, and we are going to need federal and state help.
750,000 of them come from Boston and have summer homes on the Cape.
That's true. And we're going to quadruple their rates. The second type of infrastructure is like every place else. We have our share of antiquated bridges and roads. The most antiquated are the 2 most important bridges that go over the Cape Cod Canal that bring our economic lifeblood to the Cape and affect most of our daily lives. I drove over one this morning that was built in 1955. It's being maintained or repaired yet again, therefore the backups. Those will have to be dealt with. That's a big infrastructure problem. And it's not only just an economic lifeblood, it might be actually a lifeline for some of us on Cape Cod, because we have a nuclear power plant. Bruce put this thought in my mind. We started talking about nuclear power, sitting 23 miles across Cape Cod Bay, that has now reached the top of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's list for troublesome plants. And should there ever be an emergency there, the prevailing westerly winds take everything to Cape Cod. We'll have if it's a summer especially, 1.5 million people trying to get over 2 antiquated bridges to get off the Cape. Recipe for disaster. So another huge infrastructure need there. And the third one is and this is a kind of a national issue as well, the government is probably, I would venture, the largest landowner of coastal property between the military bases, the Navy bases, and national parks. In fact, a quick aside, I believe I heard correctly in a previous conference that the Navy has 32 Navy bases around the world that are, most of the base is at sea level or no more than 1 meter above sea level. So there's a national security issue attached squarely to infrastructure. But on Cape Cod, our national infrastructure is part of the Cape Cod National Seashore. We've had already an experience back in 1978 when our most famous local storm, the blizzard of '78, wiped out the largest beach. Rather than rebuild in the same place, the Park Service very smartly moved the beach back to an existing parking lot and is now shuttling people into the beach. We're about to do the same thing in Herring Cove Beach up in Provincetown, where again we're building infrastructure like bathhouses that can be moved back as sea level rises and the environment changes. So there's some again need for dealing with infrastructure in a smart way. And that involves, my last point, you need good science to inform these decisions. For example, in those Cape Cod National Seashore beaches, and probably most coastlines, we can identify areas where we think the heaviest impact from sea level rise and from storm events will be. But you really need to know what the sea bottom is like off those beaches. We need to understand, and my Center for Coastal Studies is doing some very advanced high-resolution mapping of the entire perimeter of Cape Cod National Seashore, because there are places that are more vulnerable, although it doesn't appear from the standing of the beach, because of the lack of deposits off that beach. So if you understand the coastal processes, which are complex, that will inform where your most vulnerable spots are going to be, and of course you can direct your infrastructure there. Also, I'd encourage Bill and the group to not only go after federal money, but, and I think this is part of the agenda, make sure we're looking at federal policy. Federal and state policy, as was said by our selectman from Scituate, can be a non-cost but benefit as well. So we have to look at good science, good policy, and the dollars to address our infrastructure needs along the coastline. Thanks.
Thank you, Rich. My name is Jack Wiggin. I'm the director of the Urban Harbors Institute at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, just across the way here. The last speaker of the day in a program that has been very comprehensive and thorough, and so one might wonder what I could possibly talk about, but I'll think of something. I'm a planner by training, and so much of what the Institute does has focused on coastal planning and waterfront planning, harbor planning. The Institute has probably done 20 or 25 harbor plans or waterfront plans over the course of our existence. Rich was the director prior to I, so this will all sound very familiar to him. But as we went through those plans for all those number of years, climate change, sea level rise, coastal flooding, storm surges was never a big part of that plan. It all had to do with what those economic activities were going on the coast and what the protection of the natural resources were as an important element of what was going on in the plan. In recent years, the last 3 or 4 years, of course, it has become the primary issue that's driving a lot of these plans. I want to talk about the town of Marshfield for a moment, one because Representative Cantwell is our moderator and Paul Halkiotis, the town planner, is in the room, and they've been engaged in a regional effort to better understand the impacts of climate change on their coastline. They, on their own initiative, have attracted a couple of small grants.